Good evening, everyone. My name is Brent Reedy. I'm the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the Research Libraries for New York Public Library. Whether you are, it's got to get taller for me. I'm adjusting this by myself, which is probably not allowed. How's that? Better? Thank you. All right, start again. Hello, I'm Brent Reedy. I'm the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the Research Libraries here at New York Public Library. Whether you are in the room or joining us online, welcome to Live at NYPL. Tonight, I have the special privilege of introducing the editor of The New Yorker, David Remnick. He's here to talk about his incredible new book, Holding the Note. Holding the Note is a collection of profiles of some of the most essential musicians of our time. Patti Smith, Bob Dylan, Aretha Franklin, so many more. The profiles on these icons tend to end up taking place later in these individuals' lives. In the introduction to the book, David notes that he often finds that these individuals are grappling in music and in their own lives with their diminishing gifts and mortality. Yet there's never any diminishment to their desire to make music, to hold the note. I, like many of you, when you get this book for sale in the back of the room or to the side of the room, and David will sign copies afterwards, probably recall encountering many of these profiles through the years. But there's something electric and powerful when they're all joined together in this volume. Probably most powerfully, I remember the Leonard Cohen piece that came out just weeks before he finally succumbed to cancer. But to read that piece now, 5 years later, puts it in an entirely new and, I'd say, essential light. I love all of David's writing, but this book is probably my favorite. We are very lucky here to call David a longtime friend and supporter of the library. We named him a literary lion in 1994, a library lion in 2004. 1 year later, he joined our board of trustees. During his tenure, he has provided important counsel and guidance on many programs and policies. He's been a leading voice of our work. He's been an advocate for us in public. In particular, he has played an essential role in the past decade plus for our library lunch, in which he convenes authors, books, and ideas with the New Yorker's support as our literary partner for the last 10 years. Now, I don't want to assume what brought David to NYPL more than 2 decades ago. His tenure long precedes mine, but I know what brought me here. It is that we have some of the greatest collections of individuals, musicians, dancers, writers, authors, poets in the world. I started my time at this library, at the Library for the Performing Arts at Lincoln Center, home to more than 10 million objects covering the history of music. It is one of the largest and most important collections of music in the world. And I was struck in reading this book again this weekend, all these profiles again this weekend, how much this book is very similar to the work that we do, pulling together across time documents that cover the history of music. Every artist that appears in this book is on our shelves one way or another, and we are proud to be a resource for authors established and emerging as they dig into the history of music and try to write profiles this compelling. So again, the book is a delight to read, and if you don't grab it on the way out today or you're online, you can always check it out using your library card as well. David could not have a better conversation partner this evening. We are joined by Kelefa Sanneh, who is a staff writer at The New Yorker for years as well. He's also an incredible author of a book of music that just came out 2 years ago, A History of Popular Music in 7 Genres. That isn't the focus tonight. However, come back June 5th. Kelefa's going to be across the street at our Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library for a program focused on his book with Joe Cascarelli. So 2 bites at the apple, so please come back and join us then. At the end of the conversation, David is happy to answer some of your questions. There's paper and pen on your seats. Please scribble away while we talk. Staff and colleagues will be filtering through the audience to gather your questions while we go. If you are online, you can drop the question in chat, or you can email it to publicprograms@nypl.org. One last note before we begin. Those of you following the news are aware that the upcoming New York City budget includes a proposed $36.2 million cut to libraries. I promise that wasn't our staff doing that. These cuts are going to force us to curtail hours, services, the number of days we are open at some branches, the number of events we offer like this. At a time when libraries across the country and open access to information are under threat, we need libraries more than ever, and we need to invest in our libraries in New York. We've launched an advocacy campaign. Please visit us at nypl.org. I'm sure that many of you here have already done that. At our site, you can write a letter to City Hall to let them know that we need our funding restored. So thank you for your support. Thank you for being here tonight. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isbahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course, by all of you. Now please, welcome our evening's guests with me.
$36 million is about the price of Jeff Bezos' sail on that new boat. Cough it up, baby. All right.
I can tell you two things for sure about David Remnick. One, he is among the great writers and reporters working in the English language. And two, quite coincidentally, he is my boss at the New Yorker magazine. He's been the editor of the magazine since 1998. I've been a staff writer there since 2008. And way back in 2001, he asked if I wanted to write a piece for the magazine about hip hop. I don't think I have ever wanted anything more. He's published 7 books, including King of the World and Lenin's Tomb. He won a Pulitzer Prize for that one. I know he won a Pulitzer Prize because he had it set in a medallion, like a lanyard, and he often wears it around the office. He tells me this is standard procedure. Anyway, we're here to talk about his new book, which is so smart and so much fun to read. I devoured it in one evening. It's called Holding the Note, Profiles in Popular Music. But first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about David. My colleagues and I often compare notes about him because we're writers and he's in charge of the magazine. So we often find ourselves trying to convince him that our story ideas are good. Sometimes it goes a little bit like this. You walk into his office with some pitch you're all excited about. Like maybe there's an elderly pastor somewhere in Arkansas. No one's ever heard of him, but he's secretly influential, and the only magazine that's ever profiled him is the Southwestern Arkansas Literary Quarterly, now defunct, in 1994. And he'll listen, he'll look at what you wrote, and he'll say, "Are we sure this guy really matters? Is this worth doing?" He'll say, "If you want to write a profile of a religious figure, what about Jesus Christ?" So then your neurons start firing and you start shifting in your seat, making excuses. You say, "Yeah, well, there's been quite a bit written about Jesus Christ already, and it might be hard to get good access."
Access is a problem.
But here's the annoying thing. He's often right. And here's the extremely annoying thing. He's a really, really good reporter. He probably could write a great profile of Jesus Christ. In fact, he did write a great profile of Jesus Christ, or at least the New Jersey equivalent of Jesus Christ. That profile, a profile of Bruce Springsteen, is included in this book, along with profiles of some other musicians you may have heard of: Keith Richards, Aretha Franklin, Leonard Cohen, and of course Bob Dylan. Generally, he gets the access and he comes back with memorable stories and, more important, memorable insight. He can permanently change the way we view these characters we thought we knew. And as you might imagine, I find this deeply impressive, deeply moving, and deeply annoying.
Nice.
So please join me again in welcoming David Remnick. So, I noticed you didn't bring your guitar.
Be glad. Can you all hear us? Yeah? All right, good.
And but like these people you write about, you're a musician, and you're but you're fascinated in what it takes to make great music, right?
Well, I am, and I take, and it's an embarrassing thing to say, although I don't think I'm the only person of late middle age who does this. I take a guitar lesson every Sunday. I look forward to it like Christmas, and I can't play very well, but the one thing it does afford you get to see inside music and what they're doing and what you could be doing if you were only a hell of a lot better more clearly. It helps you listen. It may not help me play, but it helps me listen.
And there's something else you have in common with all the people profiled in this book, which is you're not a teenager.
No.
And these people in this book aren't teenagers either. You write about Phil Schaap, the Charlie Parker scholar who passed away. You call him theatrically, adamantly old. In fact, you're describing his sensibility, not his age. He was 57 when you wrote that piece. He's the youngest person in the book.
By leaps. By leaps. It's true, I am not a teenager. But I think if the book is about anything, the book is about how what you listen to when you're a teenager embeds in you like nothing else. Even more deeply than first love, I think, the first music.
Adhesive is the word you use in the book.
Yeah, and it's just, it never goes away. You hear these songs all the time, and I try to learn new things. I read, by the way, this is a ridiculous thing, him asking me questions on music. I've done this twice in my life, Q&A here at the library. The first time, the absurdity was a young writer known to very few people named Ta-Nehisi Coates asked me questions about Barack Obama and race. Kind of weird when you think about it. And now having Kay, who's the author of this just astonishing book about pop music called Major Labels, asking me about this stuff. So I'm just stipulating that right up top. So thank you for doing that and indulging me.
So there's this question that we often think about, I talk about with my kids sometimes about football and the Hall of Fame. They love Patrick Mahomes, and they're like, to him, that's the greatest football player of all time.
And who will ever be.
But there's also an argument that, no, to be great, you have to sustain it. You have to be Tom Brady. Right. You have to do it year after year, decade after decade. How do you think about musical greatness?
Well, look, there are things that didn't last that long that are certainly great. In this book, there's a piece about a Beatle, a guy named Paul McCartney. Mm-hmm. The Beatles didn't last that long. Right? They start in the mid-late 50s as kids, and they play, as Malcolm Gladwell tells us, 10,000 hours in clubs in Germany and all over the UK. But what we know as the Beatles lasts from essentially 1962 to 1970, and that's it.
Right.
And my wife and I drove in a minivan to MetLife Stadium last summer or fall, whatever it was, to watch an 80-year-old man with a hearing aid, calling himself Paul McCartney, singing these songs, and it was an utter joy, an utter joy. But the Beatles, that was a very short period of time. What's weird in this book, and it is the phenomenon of things that last longer than that.
Yeah.
And even stranger and more rarer, depends on if it's steak or not, I suppose, is the idea of a creative life in pop music that evolves successfully and in an interesting way. That doesn't happen much. Look at the Rolling Stones. When the new songs come, if there are any, and if you just dare to venture to go see them, that's when you go to get a beer.
You write here that they have not written a song of consequence in 30 years.
Yeah, but that's more than I've ever done.
Right. I was thinking, are we talking about the Steel Wheels era?
Yeah,
or?
yeah, even before. I mean, it's vaguely ridiculous, but sometimes the ridiculous is fun. Bob Dylan, on the other hand, somebody we may get around to talking about, is going to be 82, I think, tomorrow. The last time I saw him last year, it was a program of all new recordings and all interesting. And I think people who came to see it expecting to hear, I don't know, like a Rolling Stone or whatever, were disappointed and confused. But this was somebody who was going to do what he's going to do and has interesting things to say, to perform. And that, to me, was never expected in early rock and roll. This was teenage music.
Yeah.
This was backseat of the car music.
Right. I think that's true with a lot of genres when they're young, right? The rappers weren't expecting to grow up and become elder statesmen.
Or live.
Yeah. And I think, but that question, you write that about Springsteen too, that he continues to evolve as an artist, which is funny. Like sometimes that's what we want, and sometimes that's what we don't want.
And he knows it.
Yeah.
And he knows it. So Springsteen knows that his magic trick is to go to a stadium, an arena, and everybody in the crowd is, I can't see you, I'm guessing, generally of a certain age. But when we're a certain age, we don't know that. I'm 64, and my mental being is somewhere earlier. I think I'm 46. I'm not. I know that when I look in the mirror in the morning. And I also have the memory of being this other person that's still vaguely embedded of me of 17 and the car windows are open and all the rest. So his magic trick is to put together a show that takes in all of that.
Right.
That takes in Thunder Road and bombing up the Garden State Parkway and blah, blah, blah. And at the same time, shaping something that's about getting older.
Right.
Having friends who are dying and reaching the stage of life when death is not a tragedy, it's what's happening.
Right.
And to do that and have it be not Mahler or late Beethoven, but rather in a pop idiom, in a rock and roll idiom, that's unusual.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that Springsteen understood before a lot of people did was that rock and roll itself was old, right? Like by the time he comes along, rock and roll's been around.
In fact, he's kind of third.
Yeah.
Right? So you have Elvis Presley and even earlier, Ike Turner.
Right.
Sorry to say, but Ike Turner.
Sure, Rosetta Tharpe, and yeah.
And all those people, Little Richard, who's might be the most influential of all to a lot of these people, then the Beatles, the Stones, and white people ripping off black people, and all the history that we know. Then he comes along, and he's doing his thing. So yeah, by then it had a little bit of a history, but it was really very short.
But maybe that sense that he had, that he had come along to revive rock and roll already when he started, maybe that helps explain the mixture of authenticity and theatricality where he can keep that going night after night.
I think one thing that's interesting and nice about Springsteen that he probably wouldn't have admitted when he was at his real zenith in the late 70s and the 80s is that on some level, and he's funny about it now, he knows he's full of shit. He's never had a job in his life. Never. Not one time did he ever had a job in his life. And he wears workman's clothes. He wears his father's clothes on stage. It's an act.
Right.
It's part of an act. He knows it. You know it. And the one time he ever had a fight, a really bad fight over a song, I forget the song's going to slip my mind, which is part of the drama, isn't it? He wrote a song about the hypocrisy of having millions of dollars. This is kind of in the 80s. Millions of dollars and a big mansion on a hill and da-da-da-da-da. And Stevie Van Zandt, his guitar player and lifelong friend, comes up and says, Bruce, no one wants to hear about your life. Your job is to explain their lives to them.
Right.
Which is an interesting argument to have about any kind of art.
And I'm noticed when I was reading the book, I was thinking about the different approaches that these people take toward what they are doing, right? You have Leonard Cohen who's thinking about everything and overthinking everything.
That's
and
right.
he's saying, I'm going to have to go away to an ashram for a decade to really understand what I'm doing.
Right. He's a cerebral, spiritual Jew, Buddhist, poet, actor, sex symbol. By the way, great work if you can get it. I mean, that guy.
It's up there with New Yorker editor, is what you're saying.
I gotta say, there's run, don't walk tonight when you get home. Go to YouTube and punch in Leonard Cohen, comma, German woman, comma, dressing room, comma, attempted seduction of her on him. Her attempt to seduce him. It will break your heart about your, well, not you, but me. The world of erotic opportunity offered to any one individual is just to Leonard Cohen. My hat's off to him. My yarmulke is off to him forever and ever.
But he's also, there is, I think with anyone who's on stage, there's an element of being like sort of full of shit.
Yeah.
But there's also an element of what he does, it works. You write about going to see him at Radio City Music Hall. You say it's among the most moving performances you've ever experienced.
I'd never seen Leonard Cohen live before. Never seen him. I mean, for a long time he didn't play, and he just, there are some people, unless you're a critic and professionally keeping up, that things just slip by you, right? Mahler, he must be good, or
Right, yeah?
Hemingway. There are things that we have gaps, as we call it. And my wife and I went to see Leonard Cohen at Radio City, and he was on tour pretty much permanently for a number of years because he had been wiped out. His fortune had been robbed from him by some Gonoff in his circle, I think a manager.
Who did him a great disservice and his fans a great service.
Fantastic service. Because you know what? The re-recordings of those songs in his 80s, admittedly the voice is lower and he's tuned his guitar down 3 whole steps to stay with his voice and so on. They're way better than the studio recordings. His studio recordings, in a lot of instances, are terrible. Phil Spector did an album with him. It's the most overproduced, junky versions of his songs. So it was revelatory. I've never left a concert hall on air like that in my life. That Leonard Cohen show of him at 80 or whatever it was, and he was giving everything of himself in a way that you rarely see.
And then to read that and to go from that to Buddy Guy, and Buddy Guy is so matter of fact. He's like, I play this guitar. Maybe the blues are going to fade away. I don't know.
Yeah, Buddy Guy, so Buddy Guy is a great blues guitar player, and Buddy Guy's life drama is to not be the last great blues guitarist. In other words, when he was growing up, he had the very typical biography of a lot of people. He came from the Deep South. He makes his way as a young man to Chicago. He gets by in factory jobs. This is a very familiar biography for a lot of people. Willie Dixon, Muddy Waters, Bob, on and on and on, Little Walter, and so on and so forth. And the Franklin family, Aretha, and everybody in it in Detroit. And he's plays these tiny clubs and learns from Magic Slim and all these people, and then they all die, which apparently is what happens. I've read in the newspaper. And so at the moment that B.B. King is gone and he's left with this art, which is like, I don't know, epic poetry. They're not doing it anymore.
Right.
They're not doing it anymore. And there's some musicians who can play fast and well and all that stuff. And there are kind of imitators, black and white, who do, but he feels like something in the Museum of Natural History.
I mean, his daughter becomes a rapper, a somewhat successful rapper.
Somewhat successful, and he doesn't understand it,
right,
and yet is proud of it at the same time. It's a very moving thing. Look, you've written about this as much as anybody, and better than anybody, about rock and roll itself. Rock and roll itself is you tell me, does it exist? Does it not exist?
It exists as a traditional form, right?
Like the blues.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It exists to be kept alive, to be reinvented, for that spirit to be summoned up.
Right. Whereas pop is ginormous.
But when you go to talk to Buddy Guy, was he surprised at the depth of your interest in him? Or is he so used to talking to people about his music that it's just another day?
It's very hard. I've learned over the years that when you go to see people, you have about 2 minutes for them to make a judgment. There's a binary judgment, and in my vernacular, schmuck, not a schmuck. And I think the schmuck thing to do with somebody like that is try to impress them with your incredible command of the blues catalog, and just I think somebody like that is more easily impressed or made comfortable by, or you have a more successful encounter as it begins. And these are encounters,
Right.
And they have their own strange dynamic, which we know a lot about. If you're modest and listen and ask a question and then very concertedly shut up. And any time as a young reporter that I would tape an interview and listen to it, always what happened is I was talking too much.
Yeah.
Always.
That happens now. You're going over your tape and you're like, shut up.
Shut up, exactly. Either they're going to play or they're not going to play.
Right.
And sometimes they don't. And so, or sometimes the raw material you get is that's just what, Keith Richards, for example, he does what he's going to do. He coughs a lot. He says these things that he said 5,000 times. He's just not going to do it for you.
Right.
And so I found it more fun to write about him, as we say, a write around.
A right around.
Yeah.
That's where you get no access and
Or
you just
in
make
that
do
case,
without.
not even bother asking.
Right.
There was a book, and that was enough.
And how did you end up feeling about the world that Buddy Guy inhabited? It seems to me like one of the things about the blues is that it comes out of this rich context of, juke joints and places where they play, and then the context goes away, and these people are playing at European jazz festivals, and they're playing for tourists, and the music somehow lives on.
And let's say,
kind of.
and a 95% white audience, and the black audience has moved on, not last week, but since 1960.
Right. Right.
I mean, really moved on. I mean, it's the same thing when you go to the Village Vanguard. The audience is not what it was at the 5 spot when Thelonious Monk was playing there. It's a very different thing. So I think on some level, Buddy Guy is a curator of his own, of the music and of his own self. But he's an entertainer, and he's really good at it, and he brings joy to people, and he makes a living. So no one's hurt.
So, and did you feel like he could focus on the joy rather than the melancholy?
Yeah. I think he finds the melancholy banal. I think, that's a literary trope. That's for me. Oh, woe is us, the blues is passing from our life. I think that he'll play at that, he'll talk about that, but he wants to play. He wants to play, and he's not an innovator at this point.
Right.
He's 80 years old, right? And, these guys look sharp, but when he takes off the polka-dotted shirt and the sharp hat and he takes off the guitar, he's an 80-year-old guy making you a pot of gumbo.
Right.
And it's sweet.
When you write about Paul McCartney, you called him charming and shrewd. And those two words, to me, it really did summon up the weird thing that we do, right? Where we go hang out with someone, and then we try to get a sense of what they're like when they're not hanging out with people like us.
Yeah.
And is it possible with someone like Paul McCartney to get a sense of that?
Paul McCartney, in all our, we've been watching Paul McCartney, since I'm a little kid, right? I watched the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, which for those of you who are young was a big variety show on network television, hosted by a very peculiar man. Topo Gigio tonight will be, and the Beatles. And so I've been watching him since I'm in kindergarten, and he was this joyfully, unambiguously joyful presence, as opposed to John, who had a very different vibe, and of course, a biography that's marked by martyrdom of a kind. And Paul McCartney, every evidence of Paul McCartney is that he loves being Paul McCartney. He loves being Paul McCartney. And I had the opportunity to see him among his people, which are very famous people. He was screening the remake of the Let It Be album's making. It's called Get Back, and it's this long documentary made by Peter Jackson. Maybe you saw it on, I think it was on Hulu last Thanksgiving. And when I was a kid, there was this documentary, the Let It Be movie, and it was sought to be a gloomy, really, and even the colors were gloomy, breakup movie. It was pitched as kind of, here are these four people, they can't stand each other anymore, they're barely getting through the session, and George wants to run away, and John is high on heroin, and all he's paying attention to is Yoko Ono, blah, blah, blah. We've heard this 1,000 times. And this new film, as sponsored by Paul McCartney in many ways, was the epitome of revisionist history, convincing revisionist history, that even in their latter days, and they're so young, they're maybe 30.
Right.
They're so young. And they're so brilliant, and you watch this film, and you watch songs come into being in real time.
Yeah.
You know, there's this one scene, you remember it, Paul McCartney is screwing around on his bass. Bum, ba, bum, ba, bum, ba, bum, 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 bum. And all of a sudden, Get Back comes into being.
Yeah.
How did he do that?
That's crazy.
I dick around on my guitar all day long, and nothing happens.
Tomorrow's another day, David.
You exaggerate. So I think he's he's not without his melancholy. Nobody likes getting older and older and older for all the reasons we are convinced of. I think he likes being Paul McCartney very much.
You say his fan base is the general population, and even
Good line.
others.
Who wrote that?
I think you
Okay,
did.
yeah. It is everybody.
Unless an editor slipped it in.
There you
I'm
go.
not sure.
It might have been Henry Finder.
And you talk about how other celebrities like fan out when he's around. Like Billy Joel's like, oh my God, that's Paul McCartney.
So Billy Joel did a concert to close what used to be called Shea Stadium. And Paul McCartney, who has a taste for the dramatic, he got off a flight from Britain where he had just played, I don't know, Hyde Park or all of the UK, some rather large audience. He gets off the flight, they limousine him quickly to a helicopter. Helicopter takes him to Shea Stadium, dropping him off 14 seconds before he straps on the bass, and he goes out and plays I Saw Her Standing There, and then he sits down at the piano, and Billy Joel gets off the piano bench and cedes the piano to Paul McCartney, and they play, I think, Hey Jude. Remnick, veteran journalist, very grizzled, former foreign correspondent, asks the following genius question of Billy Joel. Was it hard to give up the piano for Paul McCartney? Another instance where you're sorry to have had a recorded call. And he said, no, everybody plays second fiddle to Paul McCartney. The whole world does. Why wouldn't I? Billy Joel has sold out Madison Square Garden, I think, more than the Knicks. Yeah.
When you talk to Paul McCartney, at a certain point, he drops a hot take on you. He says, I'm not sure I should say it, but they, the Rolling Stones, they're a blues cover band. I think our net was cast a bit wider than theirs. Did he know what he was doing when he told that to you?
Of course he knows what he's doing. And the idea that Paul McCartney, at age 80, has to throw shade at his rival band from a half a century ago.
It's kind of inspiring.
It's fantastic. And the end to that story is the Stones were playing God knows where a month and a half later, and Mick Jagger was told that Paul McCartney was in the audience. And Jagger gets up and says something to the effect of, well, we're just a blues cover band. They make a good living at it, though. It's okay.
As long as they keep it peaceful.
They keep it peaceful.
Do you think it's gotten harder to get good, real access to write profiles like these over the decades? Or has it always been hard?
This is what's called a leading question. You know it is. So our colleague, dearly departed Roger Angel, who died at the age of 101 a year ago or more, when he was covering baseball, he went on flights with them, he played cards with them, he gossiped with the manager. In the off season, he would go to Bob Gibson, a great pitcher for the Cardinals, and spend, a week with them, just yammering, just to get the material for a real profile. And the results were amazing. Best baseball writer who ever lived. Now, to do this in sports, professional sports, they don't need you, or in music. They have something called social media. They can communicate with their fans directly, and they and their publicists, and I'm speaking generally, they and their publicists believe that speaking to you for several days can only lead to misery, because sooner or later they'll say something
Interesting.
or indelicate or something, and it'll become not so much something in the New Yorker, but it'll be plucked out of the New Yorker, thrown into the New York Post, the Daily Mail, social media, and blow up in their face. There's the scene in the movie Bull Durham, the baseball movie, where the older player teaches the younger player how to just speak in banalities when you're talking to a reporter so that you don't get in trouble. So I think one of the gifts of being able to do this book, Holding the Note, is that these people are so past that, i.e. old, that they don't care anymore. They don't care anymore. Mavis Staples doesn't care anymore. She's 83. She lives in a high-rise in Chicago. She goes on tour. It gets her out of the house. She's having a good time. And if she says something intemperate, or she talks about almost marrying Bob Dylan at great length, as she does in the book.
An amazing alternate history.
Yeah. For Bob in particular.
Just Bob and Mavis raising their kids.
I don't think that would. I don't know how that would have gone. So yeah, it's gotten impossible. So next week we have a music issue of the New Yorker. And it has great piece, I won't say, great piece by Kay, terrific piece by Gia Tolentino. What it does not have is a profile of Beyonce.
Right.
There's nothing in it for Beyonce, in her judgment and in her people around, to reveal herself. And that's fine, it is, her gift is her music and Dianu, that's enough.
Right.
But you're right, it's a problem journalistically. And you have to you find other ways to do it.
There's also a sense sometimes that maybe readers don't need it the same way, which is to say, in the earlier days of writing about popular music, it was easier and much cheaper to read about what something sounded like than to actually go buy all the records yourself, right? And so one reason why people might read people like us writing about music was to find out what stuff sounded like.
Right, there was no Spotify, I think, and so you actually had to buy the album. And I know Spotify has been terrible for musicians at certain levels, without a doubt. It's very hard to make a living, and it's all performance at this point. But for the listener, maybe they'll fix the monetary system of it, the structure. But for a listener, I listen so much more widely because of Spotify, because I don't have to buy it.
Right.
In other words, if I want to listen to, in classical music, 6 different versions of blah, 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 I just do it. I don't think a listener is going to go out and buy 6 versions of Mahler's Ninth, or Let's Get It On, or deep cuts in any version in quite the same profligate way.
Are you able to have that same adhesive experience with a song nowadays, with a new song?
Honestly?
Yeah.
Very rarely. But if it is, it's not pop music, it's something else. Once in a while, that's not true. And this comes where the guitar comes in. I was learning, because it's in a weird key for guitar, E flat, I was learning a song called Valerie that Amy Winehouse does. Great song, beautiful song. And it's such a wonderful, tragic singer. And that's been in my head all week. But at my age, nothing stays in that head for very long. The most disturbing passage in our colleague Atul Gawande's book On Mortality is when he describes the aging brain as a shrinking walnut rattling around in its shell. Yeah. I think about that 14 times a day, when I can remember.
You write in this book, there really is one character at the center of this book. You write, practically anything I knew or read or heard seemed to come through the auspices of Dylan. And that's not even in a piece about Dylan.
No, no, no. I
And
think it's in Springsteen.
And sometimes it seems like everyone in this book has a relationship to Dylan, or you're hearing
That's
refracted through Dylan.
It's pathetic, isn't it?
Well, you
A
say
grown man,
if
to a
you've got
point.
the bug, you've got it bad.
really bad.
Would you mind if I conducted a brief poll? Could people raise your hand if you think Bob Dylan is overrated?
Oh my God. You're now dismissed.
Raise
No
your
book
hand if
for
you
you.
think Bob Dylan is underrated.
I don't see that many hands.
And raise your hand if you think Bob Dylan is correctly rated.
Correctly rated.
I think that's
My
self-fulfilling,
wife
right?
is lying.
If most people think he's correctly rated, they must be right, logically, I believe.
I think that's how our political system works. No, here's the deal. I was a little kid, and the only way you knew any music was through AM radio, pop music radio, and most of it was kind of treacly or mysterious or whatever. And I heard this song in 1966, so I would have been 7, called I Want You. And I didn't understand a word of it. And his voice, well, my father did not compare it favorably to Frank Sinatra. But it was mysterious and strange and interesting, and I went to E.J. Corvette's, which is where you bought albums in those days, because they were cheaper, and I bought a record called The Best of 1966. And on that album was Paul Revere and the Raiders, Chad and Jeremy, and a bunch of other Chazarai, and this song. And then I had to save up my bits, and I went out and bought these other records. And so I listened to this guy, kind of looked familiar, curly, and
Representation
situation, and he was representing, and he would mention things like T.S. Eliot. Now, we didn't talk about T.S. Eliot in my house, and certainly not when I was 10, 12 years old, and I'd go buy that, in a used bookstore, in a church basement, or Allen Ginsberg, or. So he was the hub of the cultural wheel, because where else would I get it?
Right.
The Beatles weren't going to provide it in quite the same way. Little Richard could provide it, but it was limited. And he was culturally elusive.
He was plugging you into all this non-musical
Country music,
stuff.
rock and roll, early rock and roll,
Right.
big band almost. So you get it where you get it when you're a
Right.
kid. I don't expect it to. Most people are going to get it from something else if they're lucky. I just felt incredibly lucky and then grateful to get it anywhere.
But isn't it amazing that you can have that experience as a kid and not grow out of it? Like, I think
It's amazing, isn't it? It's amazing, isn't it? I haven't grown out of it, and all right, I'm going to tell a story. I would say that my wife likes Bob Dylan just fine, but the regular one, like a Rolling Stone, da da da. And I said, I have tickets to go see Bob, as we call him, at the Beacon Theater, which is where he now plays. That's the venues that he tends to play. But you can't fall asleep, and you can't turn to me and say, I don't understand a word he's saying. The second thing happened first, and the first thing happened second. But it's okay. We're married for a very long time, and very happily, despite the Bob Dylan problem.
there's this quote from Buddy Guy in your profile of him. He says, "My mother told me, if you've got flowers to give them to me now. I won't smell them when I'm gone."
Live, live, live.
Was that part of your inspiration for writing these profiles? Like, these people are still around. 11 of the 11 profile subjects
Yeah,
in the
not-
book, 4 of them are gone now.
Only?
Only 4.
Leonard Cohen I interviewed, there was no question about it, he was dying. And it's the first piece in the book. It's called How the Light Gets In. And I went to see him in LA through the auspices of a friend of mine who teaches English at Claremont McKenna College, this guy named Bob Fagan. Bob Fagan was out at 2 o'clock in the morning to get donuts for the only reason anyone goes to get donuts at 2 o'clock in the morning. He was in what we used to call, when I was growing up, the preferred state. He was stoned. And he's in this grocery store at the foot of Mount Baldy, and he looks down the aisle, and there's a guy in Buddhist robes, and his head is shaved, and he's squinting, and he thinks, I'm stoned, but I think that's Leonard Cohen. And they go over, and they stand by the sliced meat department, and they have a conversation about cheese and ham, and eventually they find themselves in a car together, because Leonard Cohen was also in the preferred state, eating donuts till 3 o'clock in the morning and talking. And they became fast friends, and Bob would go see him 3 times a week to talk about books and mysticism and all the rest, and I met him through Bob. And a profile is usually, you want to do things with the subject,
Yeah.
You want to see them living their lives. At that point, Leonard Cohen's life was medicine, chemotherapy, and sitting in his house and recording an album in the way that you can do it now. He has a microphone on his desk, people send him tracks, he sings, maybe he plays a little guitar, and he produces these 2 albums. And I went to see him, and the sum total of our interaction was from 10 in the morning till 7 in the evening, talking. Talking. And he was the most vocally, the most eloquent human being that I'd ever met, or certainly among a small group. And he was, everything about the conversation was about, obliquely or directly, about having lived a good life, the degree to which you understand it, the degree to which it's mysterious, the degree to which it's been long, and the degree to which it's so quick. And that's the whole story. It's just him talking, which, as you know, is really easy to do compared to some things, because you let him do the work.
This book includes, obviously, Leonard Cohen, and then I think of Aretha Franklin, who's known for being exacting. Only one of those 2 people got very angry with you, and it was not Aretha Franklin.
That's right. Well, Aretha Franklin, when I went to see her in her dressing room after performing at a casino just across the river from Detroit, it was in Canada, she was surrounded by stacks of $100 bills in the old way.
Right.
People like Chuck Berry used to say, he'd open his guitar case, they'd put the cash in it, he'd close it, some local musicians would be there to play with him. He did not travel with a band that was too expensive. And they would say, what are we going to play? And he'd say, we're going to play Chuck Berry songs. Aretha comes into a town. There's a union orchestra set up for her with a few, band leader with her. She collects the money, and she goes out, and it's in her pocketbook.
On the piano,
The
right?
dough is in her pocketbook. She didn't want to get ripped off. And I went to see her afterwards, and she's just very wary of people in all her dealings, in business, with journalists. It's that guy, Ritz.
David Ritz.
David Ritz, who's done amazing
Incredible
as-told to
biographies,
books. He tried to do an as-told to with her, and it just came to sadness, and so he gave up and did a regular biography. It's kind of great.
Yeah.
But she didn't get angry with me. She was confusing to deal with. On the second day of my interaction with Leonard Cohen, my friend Bob and I, we wanted to give him some time to rest. He was tired. He's an old man. He's very sick. So we went into town. I think we went to Nate Now's or something to have a hot dog. And we looked at our watch. He said, he doesn't want us back until 3 o'clock. So we get back at 3 o'clock on the nose. And he was absolutely furious with us because he had it in his head that he said 1:30 or 2 o'clock. And he I haven't been yelled at like that by an adult since I'm a kid. It was humiliating. I adore this guy. I revere this guy, and he is reaming us out. At one point, he used the phrase elder abuse. Shit.
Ironically, while committing elder abuse.
Exactly. Fuck you. So and it took me, this is after he spent days, would you like a little gefilte fish? We have some bagels. We got an In-N-Out burger he ordered in. I mean, he could not have been more solicitous. And all of a sudden, he is steaming furious at us. The cloud passed, but it was like one of those thunderstorms in, Oklahoma that just wipes out the territory for a little while.
Well, and when you're working on one of these things, your job is to be like sort of neutral, right?
That didn't happen.
But do you ever push, are you ever like, hey, wait a second?
Well, it's not Donald Trump. I'm not going to, yell back. This is somebody I have real reverence for.
I have a question from someone in the audience, which is maybe related to this. Which profile was the most challenging for you? And I'm wondering, are there any of these where you thought about pulling the plug at some point?
Aretha. Because we had that initial encounter with the promise of more, and we had a texting relationship more vigorous than you would with a teenager, but the texts were really confusing and odd, and I couldn't, to use them in the piece would have been nasty, wouldn't have been right. And so it was very hard to make a piece out of that with this one 45-minute long encounter. And I'm not you. I'm not by any stretch a critic. I've never been a very good critic. I've played one on television once in a while. Reviewed a book here and there, reviewed some music. But that faculty that you have, that Alex Ross has, that Parl Sagal has, that, James Wood, I don't. I don't have. In the Bob Dylan piece, I have this ridiculous unified field theory of Bob Dylan. It's like joke criticism in some way,
So when you're at that moment, were you thinking like, oh, maybe this piece is just not going to work?
I'm going to let you in on a secret. I have a theory of this, and it might be because I'm an editor in charge of a budget. My theory is, if you've paid for an airline flight, and more than one night at a hotel, you're writing a piece. Come hell or high water.
I'm booking a flight tomorrow morning, and I have that sense as I'm on the phone with the travel agent.
Exactly.
Once this gets bought,
that's work
I got to write something.
Exactly.
Someone asked.
In the old days of magazines, when budgets were, shall we say, a little looser, when Tina Brown was the editor, this is when I discovered that I really am going to enjoy writing for The New Yorker, because it wouldn't have happened at the Washington Post, where I'd been previously. I thought I'd do a piece on Luciano Pavarotti, who seemed to be on the edge of flaming out. He had a sore throat. He was getting older, and his weight was a problem getting around on the opera stage. All this thing.
And he had a very talkative manager, which is
I loved him. Herb Breslin, fantastic. But I said, Tina, the only problem is his last performance is going to be in Singapore, and it's the day after tomorrow. And I thought, she's never going to let me go. Singapore, it's a really expensive flight. She said, well, why aren't you on the plane yet? And I thought, I love this work so much.
Springsteen is quoted in your book saying, if you are extremely pleased with yourself, nobody would be fucking doing it. And he's talking about this idea that we have that musicians are unusually needy or insecure people.
They ain't the only ones.
I was going to say, I'm not sure they can be any nuttier than writers, but have you found...
You said that, I didn't.
Have you found that to be true?
Yeah.
Is there something...
It's not that they're off. It's just that, and it's not necessarily neediness, but self-satisfaction in a creative person is antithetical to creative work. I think any writer, even if they have a shell or an outward appearance of confidence, as some do, and certainly God knows in pop music, some do. There's always something roiling inside. Look, I'm not a fool. I know that my colleagues think that I write quickly or that it's easy. This is to use a word, bullshit. It's just that I kind of leave that at home and make my family suffer. And this is terrible, this is awful, it's awful. And by the way, sometimes it is.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes the piece is kind of poor.
You're saying sometimes the final product is awful?
Yeah, mine is what I'm talking about.
I thought you meant the process.
I remember I did a short profile of the Nobel Prize winner, Japanese novelist named Kenzaburo Oe. And I knew the piece was bad. I had no more understanding of Kenzaburo Oe than I did of nuclear physics. And it ran, and I saw, my editor in those days was a guy named Jeffrey Frank, and I saw the note from Tina Brown about her reaction to the piece. And the note was, "Dear Jeff, I suppose David's piece is basically fine."
Ooh. That's bad.
Oh, man.
Well,
And I remember that for many, many more years than
sure.
any compliment I've ever received.
Well,
I'm going to name my final book, Basically Fine.
Well, I appreciate your discretion in keeping me from seeing any of those notes about my
You've never
pieces.
written Basically Fine in your life.
Someone asks an unanswerable question, so I thought I'd pose it to you.
How do we solve the Middle East question?
Basically,
Yeah.
Why can't popular music matter for politics and social justice anymore?
I think it does. I think it does all the time. I mean, yeah, Beyonce is a popular, a pop musician, but particularly to her fans, there's political uplift and content and reference to all kinds of traditions that have, if you want a song to be a flag-waving, vote this way, first of all, that's boring and banal. So political meaning and social content and comes in all different slices. Hip-hop is filled with that. Hip-hop also has stuff that has nothing to do with it.
Right.
So I don't think that's true.
My answer would
It's
have
just
been...
that it's not your era.
My answer would have been even more obnoxious than yours, I think. I would have said, I'm not sure. I think sometimes we overrate the extent to which it ever did, right?
And Bob Dylan got sick of it.
Yeah.
Bob Dylan said, after Blowin' in the Wind and Hard Rain's Gonna Fall and Masters of War and all these songs, he basically turned on the whole folk political tradition and went in another direction, and that made people crazy for a while.
Yeah.
Finger-pointing songs, he called them.
It's always been really, really hard to write a protest song that doesn't suck.
It's true.
Someone else wants to know...
Or political novels.
Yeah. Someone wants to know if you have any advice for young writers who want to write about music.
Well, Steve Martin, I think it was, said that writing about music is like dancing about architecture. It's just hard to do. And this book is about musicians, first and foremost, about lives, right? And a particular part of life. I think the gift of actually writing about music and bringing it alive and having a critical assessment and through that projecting a personality, whether it's you or Lester Bangs or Ellen Willis or Greg Page, whoever it might be, Greg Tate, it might be, that's hard. That's a really hard thing to do.
But it's an act of translation, right? It's an act of communication. You're
Which
just
is hard.
going to one place and you're
Which is hard.
experiencing something and you're telling people about it. So I'm not sure that it's so different.
But look at the challenge that Alex Ross has. Alex Ross is writing about classical music. 95% of the people he has a piece coming this week on Dudamel's conducting of Mahler's Ninth and Don Giovanni and the Magic Flute. 99% of the people who are going to read this piece will not have seen these performances. And Alex dares, because he never condescends to his readers, to talk about the inner workings of these pieces and how it modulates from D major to D minor and da-da-da. And you're with him, you might not understand. It's a little bit sometimes like, those physics books that you try to read and you think you're understanding Richard Feynman, and then you're a little lost, and then you're back in it, but you love the experience. It's like that. It's hard to do. It's really hard to do. But you know, I look at writing from an earlier generation of pop music writers like Ellen Willis or Lester Bangs.
Yeah.
They were writing about themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're writing about themselves and an era and a time and a feeling. And without that, if it's just Beyonce's new album is great, but her next album sucks, and this one is great, and that's just, you know, consumer, you know, market, you know, that's consumer reports. I don't care about that.
One last question. We have to wrap it up, but
Sure.
I wanted to kind of zoom way out and ask you about nostalgia. It's such a powerful force in music and in our lives. I think most of us harbor a special affection for the music we listened to when we were in high school.
Do you? Because you keep up with everything, and you're no longer 26 either. But yeah,
I've noticed that.
yeah, you'll notice it more.
No, there is still, like, when I hear a punk record that I loved in high school, yes, it takes me back to that era, and I'm sure it shapes the way I listen to music. We're all shaped by what we grew up on, but I'm often trying to figure out, like, were things more exciting? Do we have that sense that things were more exciting in a different time? Is music as great as it ever was?
I think music in general, first of all, music doesn't go away. Right? I remember during the pandemic, I was talking to Gia Tolentino, who writes for us, wonderful writer. She also has a piece in the Music Issue next week, which will be on your newsstands on Monday, if there are any newsstands left. And she said, you know when I know the pandemic will be over? When I'm in a crowded room dancing my ass off and I kiss a stranger. In other words, when she feels that incredible release of, or hug a stranger. She's married and has soon to be 2 children. It's an important distinction apparently in marital life. But I knew what she meant. In other words, that when that all cooped up, you didn't have that communal feeling, which can sometimes at least be such an elemental and important part of experiencing music. And let's face it, older people don't go out dancing much. And they certainly don't experience release in that same way that you might when you're 18. So that part for sure changes, but I feel as passionately about music, if not more so now, than I ever did. It doesn't feel nostalgic. It doesn't feel like, oh, Danny and the doo-wops, and that takes me back to the backseat of Daddy's Oldsmobile. No, I don't care about that.
Right.
I don't.
Well, and that's the thing about sometimes older recordings can feel contemporary. They can feel very present, partly because it's music and you're experiencing it in real time. So for those 3 minutes,
and some things, you know, with the distancing of time, are not as, you listen to it and again, and say, oh, that's not doing it for me anymore. And then you go back and you discover things that are like the line about the Beatles that I don't know who first said it, but it's so true. The Beatles were better than they had to be, which is, in other words, even if they were half as good and half as fast and innovating and changing all the time, they still would have been crazily popular. They still would have been that big. And you could say that about a small group of people.
right.
And so when I listen to something after a long while, Here, There, and Everywhere, that is a very complicated piece of work. I didn't appreciate that when I was 12 years old. I hadn't the faintest idea.
But how does that affect how you view the relative importance of genius and circumstance, right? If a singer-songwriter comes along today, there's no way they could have the impact of a Bob Dylan or a Paul McCartney.
I don't know. You may be right, but all I know is if I talk to younger people about Kendrick Lamar a few years ago, Taylor Swift right now, their intensity of feeling, their desire to see him or her or Beyonce is, I went to see Beyonce, my family went together, and it was no less frenetic or ecstatic as Shea Stadium in 1964. It was an incredible experience. Did I feel at one with that audience? No, I didn't. But I enjoyed it tremendously, and I loved witnessing it.
Final question, because I'm curious. They're about to kick us off stage. But what happens after these pieces are published? Is there any memorable feedback you've gotten, whether it's being cursed out or getting a bouquet of flowers or somewhere in between?
No, when you've written about the Israel-Palestine problem, everything else is gravy. In other words, if we were at the 92nd Street Y and I just published a book about the Israel-Palestine problem, the questions would be like this. I have a 3-part question and an opening statement. And no matter what you say, what you write, even if you exactly agree with one of those people in the audience, they will hate you. It's just an intensity of feeling on certain subjects. That's one of them. Here, if you don't like the Beatles or the people in this book, first of all, I feel bad for you. You're really missing out, and it's not too late. And you'll go on to something else. So it's a relief to write about something of depth, but ultimately about joy. Joy is rare in our lives. So it's a happy thing to be able to write about that.
Well, thank you, and it's a really fun book to read. I'm sure everyone here will read it. Thank you to David.